Okay, I think we're going to get started. There'll be a few more people that we can keep an eye on and admit for the team. If you see somebody that's in the waiting room, if you want to just let them in while we get started. I'd ask everybody to mute their mics at this point in time, just so that we can ensure that everybody can hear the discussion that's going on. My name is Shelley O'Connor, and I am the Director of Community Engagement for Hospice of Waterloo Region. I spent about 25 years in geriatric services before I moved over to hospice to lead their advanced care planning project. That I could not have done without the lovely ladies here with me today. Wanda and Patty and Lynn and Deb are part of our ACP ambassador team, and we've been providing presentations on advanced care planning for probably 5 years at least, and we've probably done over 500 presentations in that time. And the reason we're doing this series is that what we found every time we do a presentation on advanced care planning, the question always comes up about the role of the substitute decision maker. What's a substitute decision maker? What do they need to know? What kind of questions should they be asking? So that's why we're here today, and it's our very own Deb who encouraged us to start with long-term care. So we're very fortunate this morning to have Dr. Hugh Boyd and Elaine Shantz with us, and they've opted to introduce themselves when we're ready to start the question part. So in the meantime, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping points. I'm pretty sure people have become very familiar with Zoom since the COVID things since we started, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I did send out a bit of a cheat sheet so you can find things on your computer, your laptop, or your iPad. I am going to ask you, because there's about 40 to 50 people on the call, that you try and use the chat function to put in any of your questions. It could get a little crazy trying to have everybody asking questions at the same time. And two of our volunteers, Patty and Wanda, will keep an eye on the chat, and we'll feed back those questions to Dr. Boyd and to Elaine Shantz during our question period, so that we will try and get all of your questions answered. We have, for those of you, the chat on your laptop is at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a conversation bubble. For your iPad, it could be anywhere near where those three dots show up on the side or at the top of your screen. And you can type in your question, and they will handle that. In terms of your video being on or out, that's up to you. Some people find it distracting to have a lot of faces on the screen. Other people like to see the faces. So I'm going to leave that up to you. Some people do have trouble with their video being on in terms of their Wi-Fi. So I'll leave that again up to you. In terms of how things are going to go today, we are going to start with some conversation with Dr. Boyd and with Elaine around substitute decision making in long-term care. And with each question I ask them, we will take time at the end of that question to feedback anything you put into the chat. We will then have an open time at the end of the conversation around to see if we've missed any questions, to give you a chance to ask anything at that point. And then we're going to do a little bit of small group discussion, again, to give you the opportunity to talk with others around the topic, what you've heard today. And then back for more, another opportunity to finish off with any additional discussion or questions that you might have. We have this tremendous opportunity with Dr. Boyd and Elaine Shantz here to really dig into the topic of substitute decision making in long-term care. So I hope you'll take advantage of that opportunity today. What I'd like to start with, because we find people really are not familiar with substitute decision making within an Ontario context. A lot of us have worked in places where we've used materials from the US or from another province or another country that really do not align. Our laws are a little bit different when it comes to the substitute decision making. So I'm going to turn it over to one of our volunteer presenters, Lynn. She's a retired ICU nurse. She has lots of experience with this topic, and she's our go-to when it comes to trying to explain how decision making happens in Ontario. So Lynn, I'll turn it over to you, and I'm just going to share my screen so that people can see the hierarchy. Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. Good morning, everyone. In Ontario, the government has decided who will make decisions on your behalf if you cannot make decisions for yourself. This may or may not be who you would like to make your decisions, but the government has said who it will be unless you have said otherwise. So it's called a hierarchy. It goes, if you come into a hospital and decisions need to be made on your behalf, the healthcare provider will go through this list that you can see on your screen now in order from top to bottom until they find the first person available on that list, and then the list stops. They stop looking. So the first one, you'll know if this is you, a court-appointed guardian. You'll know it's you because you've spent a lot of time with lawyers becoming appointed as someone's guardian. This may be for someone, an adult with, say, Down syndrome, or unable to make decisions on their behalf, and someone has been appointed to make decisions for them. So that person would be first. The second one would be if you have appointed someone as your power of attorney for personal care. You can do this either with the free form you can download from the internet, or you can go to a lawyer and appoint a power of attorney for yourself for personal care. That person is legally now your substitute decision maker when decisions have to be made. Beyond that, if those two don't apply, there is someone called a representative appointed by consent and capacity board. This may be if I've become incapable of making decisions and I have a dear friend or a neighbor or a relative that steps forward to the courts and says, I know what Lynn would like. I know her wishes. I would like to be appointed as the person that speaks on her behalf. And again, you'll know if that's you because you've been talking to a lot of lawyers about this. Now you get down into the green section, which is family. Family is what you say it is, but the government has to have rules. We can just, my family may be different than your family in who I think is my family. But the government says the first and most high-ranking person in your family is your spouse or partner. Spouse or partner can be same sex, opposite sex, legally married, common law, or someone with a relationship of great significance. People that have lived together for years and years and years in a non-romantic relationship could be considered your partner. There should only be one person on this list, but I'll tell you my quick little story. I had a patient one time who was legally married, worked in a different city, so lived there all through the week, and then went home to his wife on weekends. He didn't live alone during the week. He had a girlfriend who, for years, they had lived together through the week. She's now his common law partner. So he legally has two spouses, a common law spouse and a legally married spouse, both making decisions equally for this man. That was a fun time making decisions with those two. Then you move down. If you don't have a spouse or partner, you go to either parents. This is parents and children. They decide equally. Those of us in the sandwich generation, a child has to be greater than 16 years of age to legally make decisions for someone else's health care. Your parent will be making decisions for you, and so will your even young adult children. So you've got grandparents and grandchildren trying to work together to make decisions for that sandwich generation person. I have a 97-year-old father who is completely capable of making decisions. He would be appointed, if nobody else on that list above him, he would be the one that would be appointed to make decisions on my behalf. I don't have children, so it would be my 97-year-old father who would make decisions for me had I not appointed someone to make them instead of him. Then you get down to the next one, which is the parent who has right of access only. If you have parents who are not together, I'll back up for 1 second. When we get back to spouse or partner, that has to be current spouse or partner. A separated spouse or a divorced spouse is no longer your decision maker unless you appointed that person legally as your power of attorney. So if you separate from your spouse and you don't want them making decisions, make sure they're no longer appointed legally as your power of attorney. So back to the parent with right of access. If a couple is not together, one parent has custody of the child and the other only has visitation rights, they would come after the one who has full custody. They would not work together. They would work separately. Then you get down to siblings. Think about yourself. How many siblings do you have? How many times do you discuss your wishes about healthcare with your siblings? Usually when we get together, we start talking about other things, not about our healthcare wishes. So do your siblings really know what your wishes are? If you have nobody else on this list, any other relative that can be found will be your decision maker. That could be in-laws, step-parents, step-siblings, stepchildren. Anybody who's married to you by blood, adoption, or marriage could be considered your substitute decision maker. All of these people on any given line have to work together. If you have 3 children and 2 parents, all 5 of those people have to work together to make decisions on your behalf and come up with one answer. That can be very, very difficult. Think about your own family. How difficult is it to come up with decisions about simple things like planning Christmas dinner? So how difficult would it be to come up with decisions about mom's health care or dad's health care? If there is absolutely nobody on this list, and that is not uncommon, every time we give a presentation, people will approach us and say, I just do not have relatives. I do not have anyone that I could count on to be my substitute decision maker. If you have no one, a public guardian and trustee will be appointed on your behalf. The courts will appoint someone. This will be a person who has never laid eyes on you, never talked to you. They will come to the hospital or wherever you are receiving health care, review your chart, and make decisions on your behalf just from reading paperwork. So you can see how important it is to think ahead and plan who will be making those decisions on your behalf should the need arise. Thank you, Shelley.
Thanks, Lynn. So we wanted you to understand that in Ontario that it is a little different in that we have this hierarchy, and the other piece to this really would be that in Ontario, decision is not made by a piece of paper. The healthcare provider or the person proposing treatment must find that person, either you or the person you have designated as your substitute decision maker, or if you've done nothing, the person who comes up, as Lynn said, on this hierarchy. So that's why we wanted to start there. So thanks for doing that, Lynn. Yes, Patty.
There is a question that came through in the chat room asking about time limits on appointing a power of attorney and whether the hospital or doctors would require one signed within a certain period of time. And we know from making these presentations that that's not the case. It's the most current form that you've got that certainly would be taken into account.
And trust comes into play as the healthcare provider. Somebody shows up with a piece of paper that says they're the power of attorney. I'm not going to go calling a bunch of people and say, is this current? Is this accurate? Unless somebody else shows up with another piece of paper with a different date. And then we have social workers that look after that for us.
I think this is a good time to segue into our guests who can comment on that question if they like, or we can just get started. But we're thrilled to have Dr. Hugh Boyd and Elaine Shantz, who's the CEO with a long-term care home, and they've opted to introduce themselves. So before we get started putting them on the spot, I'd like to say welcome and give you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Elaine, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can. And I'll just make one quick comment on that last question. However, when a substitute decision maker is appointed, the individual needs to have capacity and to make that appointment. And that's sometimes where difficulty comes in. So the timeliness of it, it can happen at any time, but you really want to ensure that the individual has capacity. So I'm Elaine Shantz. I am actually very privileged to be here this morning, and thank you for asking me. And certainly not an expert, but will probably speak from experience. I am the CEO of Fairview Parkwood Mennonite Communities, and we have 2 campuses of care and services, which I'll talk about a little bit later, perhaps as we get into some examples. with regards to senior living. My background started in banking. I always say I had 3 lives. I actually started in hospitality and then in banking, and then in the world of care in older adult living. And so I've been in the world of working with older adults and having the privilege to really try and assist them often with decisions that come up at a time in their lives when they are more vulnerable. I will also mention that I am the substitute decision maker for my mother. She is now in long-term care, was in retirement home, and then we need to make decisions for her to move to long-term care. So I've had the experience, and often as I'm working in our organization, I really can put myself in the substitute decision maker's shoes to think about what is best for my mother as well. She is not in one of our homes, so sometimes I can struggle with that. And I also, one other thing I'll mention, I've had the opportunity to teach at the University of Guelph in retirement and senior living as students go through the master's program there. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Hugh.
Okay, Dr. Boyd.
Hello, my name is Hugh Boyd. I'm the Chief of Staff at St. Joseph's Health Center in Guelph, where we try to provide patient, resident, and family-centered care throughout our entire campus. We have a hospital side, including palliative care, a long-term care side, and a very large and extensive network of community outreach as well. And including is supporting our partners in the community in the entire region. And I appreciate the opportunity here as well to support this community as well. As an attending physician, I also provide direct patient care at 2 nursing homes just outside the Hamilton area, where I'm also the medical director as well. A few other provincial roles which aren't too relevant, but I guess they asked me to talk today because I care a lot about this topic. I'm very outspoken about this topic and really appreciate that this organization here has emphasized the importance of understanding here, because Hollywood is really not portraying this legally accurate. And frankly, even what you're hearing on the federal level, things that BC is very vocal about this topic, and they have a completely different legal structure. So really hugely thankful for this group of spectacular volunteers who are looking to empower people. And I only have support for that, so thank you.
Okay. Hearing you talk about your passion for making sure we're aligned correctly with our law is music to our ears, Dr. Boyd. We talk about that a lot. So thank you both for being here. And just for the audience, this next section, we decided to kind of structure it in terms of what you need to know as a substitute decision maker around a variety of pieces of the long-term care setup. So what I'm going to start with, and I'm going to ask Elaine to answer this question first, is what do we need to know about supporting a person who's moving or transitioning from retirement home to long-term care? And I think what I have found in my work is that often people do not understand the difference between retirement home living and long-term care. So Elaine and Dr. Boyd, what do we need to know as substitute decision makers about the difference between the two?
Go ahead, Elaine.
Sure. Well, I think the one thing I would say is with regards to the difference, if you look at the continuum of care model, we tend to call it a campus of care, but it's very much the same thing. And in a continuum of care model, individuals may be in independent living. They may move into retirement home, which could also have assisted living. And then if you moved through entire continuum, you may move into long-term care. And there are differences as a substitute decision maker, as your loved one, as the person that you are supporting. is in fact transitioning. And could I just ask, we're getting a fair bit of feedback. If we could be on mute would be great. Sorry about that. So in just thinking about the differences, when an individual moves into retirement home, quite often they move into the retirement home and the individual, the older adult, is making their own decisions, and they're capable of making their own decisions. And so when we work with individuals, we really strive to ensure that they do have a substitute decision maker. But just because they have chosen someone as a substitute decision maker doesn't mean that that person makes decisions for them. If the individual has capacity to make their own decisions, they can do that. And in retirement home, very often individuals are making all of their own decisions. They may have family members or a substitute decision maker supporting them. However, they're still making their own decisions. Where we see a difference, and especially in long-term care, it has become much higher acuity in long-term care because of the shortage of beds. Quite often the placements that we see and the admissions that we see coming into long-term care in today's world are higher acuity, they're crisis placements, and the individual, the older adult, is relying more on the substitute decision maker to make some or even all of their decisions. And so the important thing I think to remember as an individual's capacity changes is that the substitute decision maker should be very aware of that. So for example, when my mother moved into long-term care from retirement home, she was able to make that decision herself, whether or not she was ready to do that. And I helped support her. I met with the caseworker with her, but it was her decision because she had capacity. Today, my mom is 98 years old and she's been on a very lengthy journey with dementia. And today I make all of her decisions from the standpoint of care and services. However, my mother still has the capacity to say that she doesn't want to eat something for lunch or doesn't want to eat at all. And so it's important to understand that as a substitute decision maker, you are acting in the best interest of the person that you're supporting. And you need to be carrying out their wishes, not yours. And that if they have the capacity to make some decisions, they still have the right to do that. And where they don't have capacity, that's where you become the substitute decision maker. And I'll stop there. Hugh, if you'd like to add to that, or if there are any questions.
That's wonderful. No, you got it.
I think it's an excellent point, Elaine, for people to be remembering it is about the capacity of the individual. When it comes to making those decisions, it's the person, and if they are not mentally capable, then it is the substitute decision maker. So I think that's an excellent point, which carries across the community of care from retirement home to long-term care. So thank you for emphasizing that point. My next question for the two of you, it would be, what does a substitute decision maker need to know about how things work in long-term care? What is the basic understanding of how long-term care is structured, how it's staffed? If I didn't know anything about long-term care, about that, how a long-term care home works, what would I need to know? And I don't know, Hugh, would you like to start? I know we talked a little bit about how each home is very different and you have to understand the culture, but maybe we'll let you start with that.
So legally, there's no difference between how substitute decision makers work in home or retirement homes or hospitals. It's the same setup. Practically speaking, though, it's very helpful to understand how these homes work, because it can empower you as a substitute decision maker to know how to make it work better. And in this case, your team at the long-term care facility has a lot of experience. They've been doing this for a very long time. But each organization may be a little bit different in terms of how that communication is best done. I bring this up because there are actually requirements for a substitute decision maker. Someone can assign someone, absolutely, but that alone is not enough. You need to be mentally capable of understanding the treatment and decisions being proposed and appreciating the consequences of them. You need to be at least 16 years old. You need to be, as hinted at, not prohibited by court by any separation agreement. And here's where the key part is. You need to be available in person, by phone, or via electronic communication, and willing to act as a substitute decision maker. Those are requirements that we as healthcare professionals know that you have a duty to commit to. So because of communication being one of the biggest challenges I consistently face in all fields of healthcare, whether it's as a community family doctor, when I was working in a hospital, or when I was working in a long-term care facility, communication is one of our greatest challenges. And that's where, as a substitute decision maker, if you can empower yourself by understanding the lines of communication, you can be more effective at being a substitute decision maker. So some of the structure I was asked to talk about around leadership and staffing, there are certain requirements that we can just be assured of will happen. All of us who work in this area, we really want this to be a home. We want this to be someone's home that they live in, that they're comfortable in. But it's a long-term care facility. So there are certain restrictions that have to be implemented in order to make sure that it is safer than unregulated organizations. So for example, there must always be a nurse, an RN, available in the building 24 hours a day. This requirement is there for all long-term care facilities. Every resident, we call them residents in long-term care facilities, and hospitals we call them patients, but every resident must have an attending physician. And that physician must be either available to provide care or provide advice to the care team, or must have a call schedule supporting them, or must inform the long-term care facility that they must seek emergency treatment to manage the issue if appropriate. There is also a medical director, though they don't have a huge role in substitute decision maker. There's directors of cares who are part of the nursing hierarchy, who are typically brilliant people who do a lot of work on long-term care substitute decision making, because these leaders get called in when things aren't going well. You also have administrators who are near the top, and then I think 6 layers above that might be where Elaine sits. But it's there is a hierarchy. These are unfortunately designed as institutions legally. However, most of us work really hard to make it comfortable, to make it a home. So some organizations may choose to have key contact people. So the nurse who's on the unit often knows people really well. No one knows the individual residents better than personal support workers. They are there spending hours with people, so they know them the best. The nurse is the regulated health professional, and that could be an RN, a registered nurse, or an RPN, registered practical nurse. And they can often be supported by nurse managers who might be covering a few different units. So some homes will have a kind of key contact person. Quite often, though, it's more common that the unit's nurse may be your primary contact. And they may either have a phone at their desk where you call and leave a message. Sometimes you reach them, sometimes you don't. When you don't, I promise you it's because they're probably doing patient care. They're giving medications, they're doing other things. Sometimes they have a cell phone. You may call the cell phone and can't reach them. Well, they might be giving medications, and we have evidence that if you interrupt a nurse when giving medications, incidents and errors happen. So Communication is really hard in this field. I'll just put that out front. Lots of places are focusing really hard on doing it better. No one does it perfectly. And I think all of us need to just understand that we're part of that. So finding ways and creative ways to make sure that you're available in person, and at these times, it's more likely by phone or electric communication is going to be really key. And then substitute decision makers, as it was hinted before, you are the substitute decision maker. I know the power of attorney term is a legal term, but I try not to ever use it. I don't always get along with lawyers, and I've not always been impressed with what some of the advice I've heard. I like to call it the burden of attorney, because power seems to think that it's something you can wield, when in fact, most people who do this realize that it's more of a responsibility and a burden. And so our care team can help empower the individual to help them make the decisions and understand the options that they have. But when a resident is competent, you may not be involved at all. When a resident is competent, we may not be allowed to even talk to the substitute decision maker. And so there are very key factors that your care team can work with you to help you understand what you are allowed to do and what you are legally required to do as well. And hopefully just building that relationship and getting to know people before anything happens is going to be a really key part of this.
Excellent point. I think there's a theme here around emphasizing that you don't get to make the decisions for somebody else unless they are not capable of making them for themselves. I hear that theme. And I don't know, Elaine, if you wanted to add anything to what Hugh said about what we would need to understand about how a long-term care home works?
I think the next question, I think he's covered it quite well, and the next question segues nicely from that. But there are a few questions in the chat. I wonder if you want to look at those.
Yeah, Patty's got her hand up, so we'll turn it over to Patty to raise those questions.
One of the first questions that was asked was, how do you determine, or who determines capacity? There's been a lot of discussion about that. And then the second one talks about attending care physicians. So let's deal with the capacity issue first.
Of course. So any health professional, and I'm most comfortable with physicians and nurses, so forgive me, I'll speak only on their behalf, but we all have the capacity, we all have the authority and the skills to determine capacity. Technically speaking, I'll acknowledge that this can be very challenging in some individuals. And what was I wanted to make clear as well, which was part of our goal today as well, is that that capacity can change. And it also can be in different scopes as well. So as was brilliantly illustrated, someone may not have the capacity to make a complex decision about whether or not to get a heart surgery, but they may have the capacity to decide that they don't really want to eat lunch today. And so we generally scope things in capacity into finances, which I promise you I'm never on the record going to comment about because I'm not legally allowed to. And then there's personal care. And so personal care, which is about, medication decisions, care, and shelter decisions, where you're going to live. And so health professionals have the capacity to do that. Many get kind of uncomfortable because it's a very challenging and legally risky thing to do. But nurses and physicians are certainly qualified. And when someone gets ill, as you can probably imagine, we've all experienced what sick brain is, and you feel a little bit groggy. Imagine that happening to someone who is very complex. And so some individuals may be fully capable 1 minute, and then an hour later, really struggling with a decision. And then 2 hours later, actually more awake and alert and feeling more able and are able to make that decision. So capacity changes, and having a healthcare professional team who is comfortable and able to make that determination is going to be key.
I think the only thing I would add to that is there, as Dr. Boyd indicated, there can be challenges with that, and sometimes there can be conflict with family members determining capacity. And we've had that experience numerous times where we then have brought in a bioethicist. So if it escalates to that point, that the healthcare team is not comfortable to make that decision, or there's some dispute, we bring in another party who then can determine whether or not the person has capacity.
Shelley, the second question, there's a third one now too, is you mentioned that you must have an attending physician. I think that this question focuses on how do you make that happen? You have an attending physician in a retirement home, but then they move to long-term care. Just some assurances there. We all know our own family doctors aren't necessarily going to be those attending physicians.
I'll try to answer this quickly. I think it steps into a little bit of a different realm, but I promise you. So there's a legal requirement that every resident has a family physician, sorry, an attending physician. And I should qualify that as well, an attending practitioner, because we see nurse practitioners providing care as well. So it'll happen. If you want to keep your own doctor, so you do have the right to request that, and that's also legislated as well. I will say though, the doctor is not legally required to accept that responsibility. And in the long-term care facility, we want physicians who are interested, who are engaged, who are capable, who have the skills to manage complex health conditions and complex family situations. And so sometimes long-term care facilities will make sure that they want people who are engaged and committed. And so you may request your family doctor to be your attending physician, but the long-term care facility may require things of them that they're not comfortable providing or don't feel that they would be best to provide. So work with your team and see how that can work out.
This is a very real question, though, and a very practical question if someone is moving from retirement home into long-term care, because they are legislated a little bit differently. Long-term care is required to have a medical director. There are many retirement homes that do not. And if they don't, important for you to have that relationship with your family doctor. So important to ask the retirement home, if someone is living in a retirement home, to ensure that you have that retirement home does have an attending physician, or what the relationship would be.
Patty, have you got another relevant question there?
Yes.
Or should we move on?
The question that would relate to this specifically is, do long-term care homes then have a list of physicians that could serve as attending physicians? And I think that really has been addressed by both of you, that there would be that support. The other question was around if a substitute decision maker has made a DNR request, will it be honored?
I think we can both agree that if that's communicated, and if it isn't clearly in contradiction to available information about previously expressed wishes, typically, and the individual themselves is not competent, sure, yeah, absolutely. So communication is really key with this. Communicate with your healthcare team. There may be some nuances to it, but yes, it should. Most long-term care facilities, this will be an important question when the resident first moves in. Even on the first day, it can be very uncomfortable having that conversation. And we always worry it's a difficult first day. There's lots of things discussed, but that typically is discussed on that first day. And if someone has clearly already articulated, that makes it easy. If someone is undecided or they're not really sure, then the default would be that term would not apply. So DNR stands for do not resuscitate. That turned into do not attempt resuscitation, because this is far less effective than what Hollywood makes it look like. And the new term is actually AND, allow natural death, which is much more medically accurate, to be honest, because death is a natural process when involved with disease. So it's something that part is frankly the easy part of advanced care planning, and that should be respected.
I think it's a good segue into the next question too, in that the next question is about how do you as an SDM establish a relationship with the long-term care staff and residents? What does that look like? What would you recommend? Dr. Boyd, you talked a little bit about that first day and the admissions piece, and Elaine, I know you've talked about the journey in long-term care, and I wondered if the two of you could comment on how does an SDM establish a relationship with long-term care staff, and that also could speak to how do you handle conflict between someone who is the designated SDM and family that are not but want to have a say. Two pieces to that.
Sure, and I think to talk about the practical side, as we've talked about, that first day is important. That admission day is important, and as we get to know in long-term care who is the substitute decision maker, but also who are the other family members, and what is that relationship? Because sometimes the substitute decision maker is making all the decisions. Sometimes the substitute decision maker lives at a distance and will certainly engage a more relaxed approach with other family members. And it's important for us as a team, especially if there isn't an agreement on care, that we know who the substitute decision maker is and that the rest of the family understands that that's the person we need to communicate with. Especially with regards to care. And, you know, it was suggested I perhaps use an example here. I have an example of an individual who moved into a long-term care home that I was part of with another organization. And this individual moved in, had a substitute decision maker, but there were 4 family members. And in this case, they were basically on 2 sides of what decision should be. So 2 of the family members were siding with each other and 2 were on the other side. However, their mother had capacity to make some decisions. And in this case, their mother decided that she was not going to see the one daughter. And she was at end of life. And her decision was that she would not see her daughter. However, the substitute decision maker thought that his mother should see the daughter. But it wasn't the substitute decision maker's decision to make, because mom had capacity and to make that decision. And so when we talk about the relationship with the care team, it was incredibly important for us not to get into the middle of it, because the 2 sides were not in agreement with each other. And we had to, in that case, we were listening to our resident and what her wishes were. And so some of the family members would come in and try and draw staff into the conversation. So in that case, as Dr. Boyd identified, it was important to know the hierarchy of the organization, even though we don't wish to bring that in unless we have to. And it even got to the point of the resident's death, that the family was determining when would she lose capacity and could that daughter come in, because the substitute decision maker would make the decision. Incredibly sad and very, very difficult situation. And the resident did pass away. She did not see her daughter. Her wishes were respected in the end, and as an organization, we really needed to support that. And not all our staff agreed how things should be handled, but it was important for us to ensure that we followed the residents' wishes. And at some point, if the substitute decision maker would have been at a stage where he was making the decisions, he would have made probably a different decision. So those are things that are important, and not to jump ahead, but when choosing a substitute decision maker, So it's incredibly important that everyone knows the wishes of the individual, especially when you're traveling that long-term care journey.
I don't know whether Pat, whether Dr. Boyd, you have anything to add to that. I think if I'm brand new, I've brought my mom in. She's moved into long-term care. You know, and there's the day-to-day decisions to make about what her clothing and what she's eating and all of that sort of thing. And she's able to make those decisions. But if there's a situation like you talked about, Elaine, where there's all of a sudden conflict, what do I need to know about who I work with in a long-term care home to help? Is it the charge nurse that's on the floor? Is it, you know, who am I working with, and how am I resolving this? Are we calling family meetings? I know you talked about trying to stay out of the middle of it, but as an individual as I'm coming in through the doors, I need to know who I'm working with to try and resolve some of it.
You know, on a day-to-day basis, our PSWs are the eyes and the ears, and they are providing care. And when it's a good relationship, which 99.9% of the time it is, it's the PSWs know your family member often better than we do. And I have to admit to that, even as a substitute decision maker for my mom. The PSWs are with her every day providing care. However, if there is something that is of concern, then it's good to talk to the charge nurse, and if it can be resolved, that's the best way to do it. They're working with your loved one on a day-to-day basis, and that works the best. However, if it's not resolved, it's important for you to know who's the director of care. Sometimes they're called directors of nursing, directors of care, various titles, and that you can talk to that person if you need to. And really, you need to have the comfort level that anything that you need to have resolved, you've got the right person. And sometimes, occasionally, I do get involved in a situation where there's something that's been difficult, but not all that often. So certainly working with the team right there on a day-to-day basis is important. And a lot of families are very relaxed about, you know, bringing clothing in and making those day-to-day decisions. But that's why it's incredibly important to know the relationship of family members and the substitute decision maker.
Thanks, Elaine. Dr. Boyd, before I open it up to see if there are any questions, did you want to add anything to that piece?
I think that was well said. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Patty and Wanda, are there any questions in the chat that we need to address before we move on?
Lynn has asked us if we could also talk a little bit about choosing an alternate substitute decision maker. We've talked about a substitute decision maker, and in Lynn's presentation, she talked about not appointing or having a team of substitute decision makers, but maybe Lynn could reference and talk about alternates.
It's very important that the substitute decision maker is available, as Dr. Boyd had pointed out. What if they aren't? What if that person has become ill? Who do we appoint as our substitute decision maker is usually someone near and dear to us that we spend time with. What if we're both in the same car accident and neither one of us is available to act as each other's substitute decision maker? Then you would go back, the healthcare team would have to go back to that hierarchy to find the next person available. Is that the person you would want making decisions for you? If it is, fine. If it isn't, appoint an alternate. When you're doing the legal paperwork to appoint a substitute decision maker, appoint an alternate decision maker if that first person is not available. I'm a bit of a control freak, so I worry, what if that person isn't available either? I appointed a second one. My bases are all covered, I think.
Wanda, did you want to add something?
Yes, if I can unmute myself here for a moment. I'll tell my really quick story about my trip up to the Barrie area a little while ago with my partner in the car, my daughter, my son-in-law, going to see my son-in-law's mother who is just going into long-term care. And at some point along the busy 400 highway, it occurred to me that here I was in the car, one car, with my substitute decision maker and my alternate. If we had been in a big accident, well, maybe nobody would have survived, but it was a good reminder that having two substitutes might be a good idea. And I would like to say the other thing that I keep hearing over and over from our experts and the questions that are coming up is that you have to talk about these things. You have to talk about them early on, and you have to keep talking about them because they keep changing. So that when you get to that point where you have to make those decisions or you have to provide care, you've got the information that you need.
That's a very good segue, Wanda. It's a very good segue into the last question before we open it up. And I have to say, Dr. Boyd and Elaine, we get so many questions about, okay, what are the kinds of decisions that I am going to have to make as a substitute decision maker? Can you give me a list of the scenarios that I need to go over with my family? What are the treatments that I may have to decide about? And we miss a lot around values and what's important to the person. And I'm hoping that you can both answer this question, share a little bit about what kind of decisions are substitute decision makers making in long-term care, just to give people a sense of what that looks like, what that role looks like in long-term care.
Absolutely. I'm happy to start out, and Elaine, please jump in. So in the medical world, in the healthcare world, we talk about decisions that need to be made now and decisions that need to be made in the future, or we make the decision in advance of the future situation. So there's a whole terminology, they call it advanced care planning. It's not advanced, it's not complicated, it doesn't take a PhD to understand, but it's stuff we do in advance of the situation that comes up. Right now, we're not going to do a lot of that because traditionally, the only person who can do advanced care planning in ahead, is the person themselves. And so substitute decision makers are typically legally not allowed to make decisions in advance and for their loved one, with one single exception. And so there's lots of things you can do if you're the substitute decision maker for someone who is competent, or even if there's some challenges there. Certainly look into the advanced care literature, talking about urging the person that you're the decision maker for to communicate with you their wishes, values, and beliefs. And this is the most powerful thing you as a substitute decision maker can do, is to really understand that person. And it may mean asking them uncomfortable questions like, do you know anyone who's died of cancer? How did that make you feel about how they were cared for? What kind of decisions would you want to make for yourself if you were facing a life-threatening illness? And there's lots of great methodology out there. We've got some good handouts here about how to have those conversations with the individual, because that is going to really give you some great empowerment, really, to give you great skills and great knowledge around this. There are a million possible decisions that you may have to make in being the decision maker for someone who's living in a long-term care facility, because there's a billion situations that we may encounter. Everyone's unique. And so what's challenging is you can't really predict everything that's going to happen. We can try, we can anticipate, and as a healthcare team, we can talk about prognosis or what may be coming in the future, and give you a heads up that you may have to make a tough decision around this. You're not allowed to make the decision as a substitute decision maker now, but you can ask questions about it. You can try to gather more information ahead so that when that difficult time comes, you're more ready to make that decision. So we'll start with the first one. And one of our members, Joan, is asking about DNR, or allow natural death. That is that one situation where the substitute decision maker can make a decision in advance of the situation. And practically speaking, I think we understand why. death and taxes, they're going to happen. And so if someone is going to pass away at some point in their future, we don't know when, it could be 2 days, it could be 20 years, it could be 90 years. It's nice to know what we as health professionals should do, because our default is to attempt resuscitation. And that is a very complicated and complex series of medical procedures that involves many part of the nursing team and the physician team, and it ranges from, I'm not going to go into it, but what you see in the movies, the effectiveness is not even close to what they show it is. But that's a separate issue. Really asking the individual, if you can, to think about, what would happen if your heart or lungs were to stop and you had passed away. Clinically, someone's dead, and we can attempt to try to resuscitate you. So I've talked to my wife about this. She knows that, if you see me pass out, please start all that resuscitative measures. I think my heart's okay, my lungs are okay, my brain's okay. So if I'm not getting oxygen for a minute or two, there's going to be brain damage. There's going to be significant brain damage. No one walks away from resuscitation without some trauma to their body. But I think I have enough reserve that I could handle that. And so asking the individual what their wishes are, if you can, would be really key. And then talking to maybe your healthcare team about that future planning, about, what would happen if this person or someone did have a heart attack? What would that look like, and how would that feel? So that's going to be one of the first decisions you'll make. And when you move into a long-term care facility, typically everyone is forced to make that decision. I can't tell you how many people I've encountered whose families have never really thought about this. And so undecided is a disturbingly frequently checkbox that happens in long-term care, where we say, okay, you haven't decided. The default is what we call full code. And so this is a chance for you as a decision maker, whether you're before or in long-term care, is to have those conversations. Love the comment that was made earlier about, talk amongst each other. So you may be the substitute decision maker. It feels like you have all the power, but you've got a team of other people who are, I know my family, they're ready to criticize every single decision that could be made in that kind of situation. I literally, in the last week, was working with a physician who was a substitute decision maker, and she begged me to please focus on the other family member, because she wanted to just be her daughter, and she was sick of being the decision maker. And as I said, there are 5 criteria of a substitute decision maker. One is willingness. It worked out really well. And so that's the first big decision you're going to make around that. As a substitute decision maker, if the individual isn't confident themselves, you're going to have other decisions like, what do they like to eat? What do they like to wear? Do they like to get up at this time? When do they want their baths? How do they want this care? Care in long-term care, there's a huge, huge part of it. And so we often focus on the medical decisions, but as a substitute decision maker, you're going to be involved with all kinds of decisions, day-to-day stuff that you and I we make that decision. We make 1,000 decisions throughout the day. And if an individual can't make them, then it'd be nice to get your input as to what you think they would want. Because again, if you're the substitute decision maker, we have to assume that you know their wishes, values, and beliefs about care. So you don't have to tell us exactly, well, I know, you don't have to go through a checkbox and find out every single thing that they would want. I know lawyers like to charge for these things called living wills. And in my 12 years as a physician, I've not seen a single one be helpful with decisions in the end. Because you can't really predict everything. They try, bless their hearts, they do try. But it's just hard. So an informed decision maker who knows wishes and values. So wishes are obviously statements that the individual makes, not the substitute decision maker, but the individual makes about what they would like. Values are, I think we understand, are kind of concepts or constructs about what things look like. And beliefs about care, beliefs are looking at, I wish this hadn't happened to me. Strong statements like that you can recall. if you want to be a, superstar substitute decision maker, write as much of this as you can. So if someone says something, write it down, date it. Because when your sister comes at you and says, why'd you make that decision? Gosh, it's sure powerful to say, Mom literally said this word for word on January 22nd. Makes a huge difference. I've tried it too, it works. That being said, you're also going to be involved with some really complicated decisions around medical care. And so if the individual is not competent for them, we're going to ask you, doc wants to increase this blood pressure medication. You're going to say, I don't care. Sure, the doctor said it should be done. Just do it. Well, no, we need to ask your permission. And then there's going to be more complicated things, medications that you don't understand, you've never heard of, or medications that you've read in the newspaper are scary or dangerous. And so there's a lot of things that you may end up encountering in the future. And eventually you may also be involved with decisions around end-of-life care. And this is where we as a healthcare team have the greatest challenges because it's so high stakes. There is so little room and time for conflict. And as a substitute decision maker, if you can't make a decision, you can't just do it. So if there's conflict, if things aren't working out amongst the family and two decision makers are fighting, please don't ever appoint two sisters as decision makers. You know what, I'll give you bonus points if you ever get a son to be a decision maker. That's remarkable. That's very rare. And try to come together. So if you don't come together on a decision, nothing happens. Nothing. Except for an emergency situation where someone is imminently going to die or suffering, I can overpower you. I can say, okay, you're not deciding. This is what we're doing because I can't wait on you. But if it's not one of those emergency situations, which as you can imagine, when there's conflict, it probably isn't, nothing happens. The person you love sits there. And so there may be very complicated decisions around, feeding tubes. Do we use intravenous hydration? Do we use advanced medications? Do we use the hospital? Do we use the ICU? The medical machinery is phenomenal. We are doing things we weren't doing 10 years ago. But, we're also doing things that some of us wonder, should we be doing? And so having those conversations about, what does the future look like? It's not easy for us to do. We healthcare professionals are pretty crummy at predicting the future, but we can try and we can work with you and asking, what decisions do you think I will be facing in the near or distant future? That single question gives us as a healthcare team, first of all, we'll love you because difficult decisions, they just get harder as time goes on. And so if we can kind of prepare you, we can say, thank you for asking. First of all, most people stall this until the last possible moment. I've dealt with 2 of those situations this past week. But we can talk to you about that. So I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you that you can ask your team to give you a hint as to what may be coming, and you can ask your team to help you. You can ask some of those questions in advance. Again, you can't make the decision in advance, but you can be informed and ready. So when it happens, your family knows, the people who might be running and complain to you, well, why'd you make this decision? They all know, and that you can come together as a team. So even that you as a substitute decision maker, it feels like so much falls on you, the burden does, but you have a team. You have your health professionals, you have the person that you're representing who knows you, that you know well, and you have your family who understands that you've taken this seriously.
Very good, Dr. Boyd. Thank you for sharing all that. I'm going to come back to the 2 sisters at some point, I think maybe on a personal note. I do, and working with lawyers, we have heard don't pick a committee. Don't pick a committee of people to make decisions on your behalf. But I just wanted to turn it back to Elaine just to give you the final word on this topic around the kinds of decisions, especially with your unique position of working in long-term care and also being the decision maker for your 98-year-old mom. So how would you answer the question about what kinds of decisions?
Well, I think as Dr. Boyd said, there are many decisions and we can't really know in advance what those decisions might be. But on a practical stand, I think it's really important for the team to know, as he identified, beliefs and values. It's important, and especially as we are journeying towards end of life, if your team knows, if we as the healthcare provider know what our resident wishes, what are their beliefs? You know, are they Jewish? Are they Mennonite? What are their beliefs? What are the individual's wishes for end of life? And also, and not just the advanced care decision making, but very practical things. What kind of music do you enjoy? Who is the person that we would want to bring in as a spiritual care support? What are the wishes that you would have as you are reaching end of life? Do you want your family present? Do you want to be alone? And people often have some very clearly defined thoughts about that. And so as your team, we want to know all of that. And the more we know about that, the easier it is for us to support you. We also want to know, when do we call you? For example, with my mom, she happens to have seizures. I want to be called every time she has a seizure, because I want to have that conversation as to whether I'm going to come in and be with her at this time. It's also nice to have, in addition to that legal document for the substitute decision maker, there are a lot of really good seminars and things that an individual can participate in ahead of time. I have all kinds of little pieces of paper in my mom's own handwriting saying, these are hymns I would like at my funeral. These are, and I have in her handwriting that I do not wish, I would never wish to have a feeding tube. I would never wish to have something keep me alive once I do not have capacity. And it's in her handwriting. And it's something that as a substitute decision maker, I can share with the entire family, even though I'm the person that's making the decision. So as we go back to, there's that whole legal side of things, but the more you can talk about it ahead of time, it really helps us. And I think Dr. Boyd said it right at the beginning of our session. This is, long-term care is our residents' home, and we want to make it home. So the more we know, the more we can really support our residents.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you for sharing that. So, Patty, are there any questions that we need to address?
Yes, there is one that relates to what we've been talking about. And Joan wants to pursue the whole issue of levels of do not resuscitate. If a resident, for instance, willingly and knowingly does not eat and therefore goes into some kind of diabetic shock, what would the role be of long-term care in supporting them? Would they take them to hospital? Would they give them something to recover because they know what the situation has been when that has occurred?
I don't mind fielding this. First of all, I won't be answering any specifics about that question. I encourage you to connect with your own clinical team about the specifics of that. I cannot give advice, medical advice in this forum. There are thousands of factors that go into decisions in medical advice, and I just can't comment on that specific situation because there's probably a lot of components that I'm just not aware of. So I'll encourage you, regarding the second question, talk to your care team about their capabilities, about the situation and what would happen. In terms of the various levels of DNR, or allow natural death, which I know you already used the terminology for, Joan, thank you very much for doing that. There are, and so the hospitals are taking this a lot more serious than elsewhere. So I'll just say, technically, yes. So there is something called the POLST form, and forgive me, I forget what it stands for, an innovation that started in the United States and it's spreading all over the world, frankly, And it's looking at making it more specific so that it's not just an all or nothing thing. It's looking at, well, maybe you want electric shock, but you don't want the intubation tube down your throat. And so there is this phenomenon that's coming out. It's caught on in a few hospitals in Ontario. It's caught on in only a couple of nursing homes, and they're ones that are typically associated with hospitals. So I would say that it's not very common. Legally speaking, DNR, allow natural death, is still kind of an all or nothing type of thing from the long-term care perspective. And so we either trigger the entire machinery or we don't. That being said, you are able to guide it at the time, or you can make the express wishes ahead of time too. You could try to say, well, we want, full code with the exception of electric shock, because I know, this happened in the past, and I just know that he would never want to face that again in his future. So you can try to make those communications to your team. It will be challenging because this isn't common. So this is just starting to catch on. And again, communication, documentation is going to be really key. Communicate, and try to make sure that those requests are very crystal clear. And sometimes that means putting it on paper.
I don't know, Elaine, if you have anything you want to add to that? Nope. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, lost my mouse here. No, I think that that really nails it. I will just, from a personal standpoint, say that for my own mom, right now, her wishes are comfort measures only, but there are still decisions that need to be made around that. What is a comfort measure? Is an antibiotic a comfort measure, or is it sustaining life? And so there are always still those decisions to make. And kind of back to some of your original thoughts, Dr. Boyd, on there are going to be decisions that we can't anticipate, that we have to answer.
Elaine, you've touched on a very advanced concept, goals of care. And if you as a substitute decision maker use the words goals of care, you will win my respect as a family member for life. And I worked with a cardiologist that said everything we doctors and nurses do should be to either help someone improve their quality of life or comfort, or help them to live longer. And so those are generally the two goals of care, and sometimes they work well together and sometimes they conflict with each other. You get bonus points if you talk about goals of care with a nurse or a doctor.
Okay, well, I'm just gonna, I might get demerit points for this comment, but we do a lot of work around advanced care planning. Goals of care is a term that often comes up in the healthcare field, and I just wondered if you could take just a minute, Dr. Boyd, maybe to explain to people the difference between advanced care planning and goals of care discussions, because that comes up a lot, and we're trying to keep people from being confused. So if you just take a minute to clarify the difference for people.
Yeah, let me just say, I'm so impressed with the moderators and Elaine and the question. We're covering a lot of ground today. Very impressive. So goals of care is, you're right, it's more of a healthcare term thing. As we talked about it, we doctors are obsessed with morbidity or mortality and blah, blah, blah. So we as a healthcare team, we like to know what the goals of care are, because it can influence our recommendations. This gets tricky though. And so I will say that when I'm counseling an individual, I'm working with an individual who's competent themselves, I like to talk about this a lot and talk about the balance of those things, about what's important to them. How can I be your doctor? Or what's the phrase I used the first meeting? It's, what can I do to be the best doctor for you? And so that kind of talks about what is important to them for their medical care. So for substitute decision makers, though, a lot of doctors and nurses will ask substitute decision makers, well, what's the goal of care here? And Elaine summarized something perfectly. And so, you know, if someone's goals of care is to live as long as possible and to live as comfortably as possible, great. Someone's goals of care may be, well, you know, I don't know if I want to live as long as possible because you guys do some pretty invasive stuff in the hospital, but I want to be as comfortable as possible. So, you know, maybe I'm okay with medications that may shorten my life, but make me feel more comfortable. Or what's more likely is, you know what? I don't want to take that stupid cholesterol medication that's giving me muscle pains. Sure, maybe it'll keep me alive a little longer, but I want to feel better and not necessarily live as long. And that's kind of what we talk about goals of care. It gets tricky because those goals of care are best coming from the wishes, values, and beliefs of the individual. And we might be pushing substitute decision makers to make those decisions about what their goals of care are. And that's fair and that's common. We often ask decision makers to make that differentiation. But you're also allowed to, you know, state this is the goal of care, but, you know, what is the best treatment? What is the best medical treatment? And so it may be comfort care only, where someone said, you know, I just want comfort and comfort only. Well, still ask what the best decision is, because we as a healthcare team, we can provide that. And it may clearly conflict. So for example, you know, someone may have end-stage colon cancer, and so they've suffered a heart attack. And so the best medical care may be rush off to the hospital, get the blood tests, get the investigations, consider putting a stent in or opening up the heart. And that might be the standard of care. And so you're allowed to ask that. And I encourage people to ask, what is the standard of care? What is the best medical treatment? But you can also say, you know what? We're at end-stage colon cancer or end-stage Alzheimer's disease. I don't think my family member would want that. I think she would rather just be kept comfortable. You know, maybe let's still consider maybe some life-prolonging antibiotics, but actually maybe not. And it can trigger all of these conversations and decisions around that goal. So you're still allowed to ask for and still entitled to have the best medical treatment. But we'll often ask you what the goals are, because then it can help us make a more individualized treatment. The standard of care that the lawyers hold us to isn't always the nicest and most compassionate, person-centered care. So we want compassionate, individualized, person-centered care. We also are being held to a standard that is not exactly person-centered.
Thank you for that. The hairs on the back of my neck always go up when I hear goals of care without it being linked to how it fits with advanced care planning. And so what I would say to add to that is that advanced care planning are the conversations that you as an individual have with your substitute decision maker and your loved ones. So they understand your wishes and your values and what's important to you, in order that when you get into a situation where in a long-term care home where you have a specific condition or there are specific treatments that you have to explore because of where you are in your healthcare journey, there is some kind of condition that you're facing, those goals of care conversations are with your health care provider, and the homework, the work you've done ahead of time in advanced care planning to explore those wishes and values will inform that discussion. So I always like to, our job as the public is to start with the advanced care planning, is to start with those conversations that can guide those conversations that become more specific and more specific in your healthcare journey, ultimately resulting in a consent or refusal of treatment. Does that be fair to say? Elaine, does that make sense? I think that we throw around a lot of terms, and I just want to make sure people understand that I think our job as the public is to start with advanced care planning conversations. We were going to go into small groups and have a discussion, but this has been so great, so fruitful. We have about 8 minutes left, I guess, and I thought We could open up the for questions. If anybody in the audience has a question that they want to put, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. We'll see how this works because there are about 40 of you, so it could get a little bit chaotic. But if anybody has a burning question that they would like to ask, this is the time to ask, and then we'll move into the closing. Go ahead, Lynn.
I'd like to add into Dr. Boyd's comments. I worked for 1,000 years in intensive care units as a nurse. A lot of people would ask for do not resuscitate orders. A lot of people would not ask for them because they felt they would not receive treatment. If they'd just say, well, you're just going to let me die anyway. Do not resuscitate does not mean do not treat. You can be treated with the antibiotics. You can be treated for that heart attack. You can be treated for all the other things that come along. But if your heart stops, we will not try to restart it. And the other question we would always ask people is, I love the example Dr. Boyd gave. I have end-stage terminal cancer and I have a heart attack and they're suggesting all these treatments for my heart. We would say to the patient and their SDMs, we'll try to get this person better, but to do what? Get better from the heart disease to die of bowel cancer in a month? If that's what you want, great. If that's not what you want, time for that big discussion.
We have a question in the chat room asking about the whole transition from retirement to long-term care and how soon you need to start that process when you see that your loved one is requiring more support and then the actual retirement home is able to offer. Can you give us some insights into how long a process this is? We've all heard the horror stories. It would be helpful to hear from the two of you when we should all start working on this.
Probably now. No, seriously, when you are in a retirement home, it is incredibly important to really be thinking about if the healthcare needs are changing, if the resident, if your loved one's needs are changing. It's incredibly important to start to think about when you might need long-term care. That said, many retirement homes can provide, and we are very much trying to provide home and community care more so that individuals can stay in retirement home longer. Wait lists for long-term care are incredibly long. And to be perfectly frank, at both of our long-term care homes, I have been here at Fairview and Parkwood for 3 years, and the reality is no one has moved on the wait list. In that time, we have only been able to admit crisis placements. And so that's not what you want. And I'd love to tell you something different, but the wait lists are incredibly long. And once someone is a crisis placement, then it moves much quicker because you're being given priority. So it isn't easy. Important to know that more and more in retirement home, you can access home and community care. And in fact, we've been very privileged. We have a partnership with the LIN that our staff is actually providing home and community care out in retirement homes, independent living buildings, so that people can stay in their own home as long as possible. But back to your question, you also have to qualify for long-term care. So I can't put my name on the wait list for long-term care in hopes that it will come up when I need that care. You have to qualify for long-term care and go through an assessment to qualify for long-term care before you can put your name on a list for specific homes. It is important, though, to tour homes, to know what's available, especially if you are a substitute decision maker and your loved one is becoming a crisis, potentially what they will call a crisis placement. And it's important to identify homes that you feel comfortable having your loved one live in. So tour some homes, ask some questions, find out that the values of that home meet your values, and that your family member will be comfortable there. It's not easy right now, and I will say that you know, our government is promising to build more long-term care beds. Hopefully the situation changes, but it is important to think ahead. But there are some barriers, and find a good resource to provide information to you. We often get calls and are happy to try and provide that information, or even do education sessions with older adults as they're starting to make those decisions.
Just if you got one more.
Yes, Joan has a couple of questions about assisted living not really being your home, so that if you are hospitalized and they feel they can't care for you, they don't have to take you back. Is that true? And secondly, is there not a restriction on the number of hours of care that you can get as someone who's not already in a long-term care facility through the LHIN or whatever organization we're now under?
A good question. We understand our responsibility as a retirement home, that if we are assisted living, that we are required to take the individual back into our home. It is our philosophy of care that we will do that regardless, as long as we can safely provide that care. And where it might become a question for some homes is if someone needs a two-person lift or a mechanical lift and transfer. If that home isn't equipped to do that, that could be on the realm of safety. But in general, we are required until other arrangements can be made. So they may come back into our retirement home. The LHIN will provide care, and I have seen it up to 24 hours of care, but that person is then has been determined to be a crisis placement for long-term care, and then will generally go to long-term care quicker than they would otherwise, because hospitals really don't have the capacity for individuals to stay. And yeah, so I'm not sure about the restriction. Generally, with the LHIN on the hours, what we see very much can be up to 24 hours of care. Quite often it's coming in 2 or 3 times a day to provide specific care with the activities of daily living. Oh, good question about can you tour the home during COVID? No, I'm sorry. We do virtual tours. And, you know, a really, really cool story, now that we can have essential caregivers come into the home, into our homes, it's fantastic. We've had lots of tears of excitement because we've had individuals who moved into one of our homes during COVID when they couldn't come in, didn't even see where their loved one was, and now can come in provided they're tested. But no, we're doing virtual tours of the home right now.
Okay. Deb, I'm going to turn it over to you as we're running out of time. Deb is the inspiration behind this session, so I thought it was fitting that she finish us off.
So let's start with our thank yous. First of all, to all of our participants who joined us this morning, your willingness to come along with us on this crazy journey of being exposed to new information and learning through Zoom is greatly appreciated. It's been quite a journey as the ACP ambassador team has tried to figure out ways of getting this information out to the public. So we're really grateful that you came along. Secondly, thanks to the Hospice of Waterloo Region for providing the platform for this important information, and to Shelley, our team cheerleader and our tech coach and our organizer. And Shelley has been critically important in keeping the momentum going on this and on this process of getting the information out. And finally, of course, all of us want to express our incredible gratitude to Dr. Boyd and Elaine for being with us this afternoon or this morning. You were so gracious in giving us your time and your honesty and your knowledge, during which I can only guess has been an incredibly hectic time. I wish you could hear applause. There's probably standing ovations happening all over the city. So we appreciate your insights and your honesty, and we thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for empowering others.
Oh, thank you. We're a great group, aren't we? Thank you all. And I will send out to the participants just a little evaluation afterwards and a few materials. But otherwise, our next session, we're going to take a look at substitute decision-making within the context of hospital. So that will be in October, and I will send the information out to participants. And we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you both very much. Thanks, team. You're awesome. And thank you, participants.